Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Kevin O'Leary, General Manager of Business North Harbour, and so delighted to see so many people online today. There's still a few more people that we're waiting for, but again, really conscious of time and those of you that have got here on time, so we'll make a start. So as I say, welcome today, and today's webinar is the fifth and the penultimate session in a weekly series which Business North Harbour is providing, covering topics based upon the feedback received from members in our recent Business Resilience Survey. Before we talk about today's webinar, really important task, just need to thank all our sponsors. So our gold sponsors, North Shore Golf Club, Waste Management, Pathfinder Solutions, Driveline, Montsellier Law, Ramada Suites by Wyndham Albany, Spark Business Hub, Auckland North, the Mark Group, Dale Carnegie, and Benefits. And we also have our silver sponsors, Phone Plus, Davenport Law, and Turner Hopkins. And also huge acknowledgement to Eclipse Recruitment, who are our Women in Business sponsor. So today we're looking at legal compliance and employment law. One of the many challenges for employers as a consequence of the pandemic has been staying on top of legislative changes and employers' responsibilities towards their staff in response to changes in government and legal guidelines, which have not always been easy to understand. Today, we will help attendees to navigate their way through the latest changes and requirements, ironically, while we're waiting for some more changes at 1 o'clock today. This week's guest presenter is Bronwyn Newcomb. Bronwyn is a director at Davenport Law and is an employment lawyer under the commercial law team, whose primary focus is to provide clients with early, effective, and pragmatic resolutions to complex employment law issues. Most recently, she has advised and provided thought leadership on the effect of the pandemic on employers, employees, and the workplace itself, which makes her the ideal person to deliver today's session. We're delighted to have Bronwyn with us to share her knowledge and discuss some of the challenges our members are currently facing. Before I hand over to Bronwyn, just a quick word about the format of the session. Bronwyn will talk about a number of topics for around 20-25 minutes, following which she will answer any questions. You don't have to wait until the end of the session to submit your questions. Please put them in the Q&A as we go along, and Bronwyn will deal with them once she has finished her presentation. So without any further ado, I'm delighted to introduce Bronwyn Newcomb.
Thanks, Kevin, and kia ora everybody. Great to see so many people on this session. So thank you, and thanks for the warm introduction, Kevin, as well. Yes, so Kevin and I both believe in short and sweet and getting things rolled out as quickly and efficiently as possible because we know that you are all busy. We also know there's a level of Zoom or online fatigue, so wanting to make sure we deliver the information in a really quick and easy format and then let everybody get on with their day. So that's our intention. So I will try and stay right on point, and then we'll allow questions at the end as well. So the first topic I wanted to talk about are vaccine mandates, and so just having a brief overview of where we are up to and giving some information for particularly SME businesses in our bid and further afield to give you more information as to what you could or should be doing with your staff. So just a reminder from last week, I think it was, a lot of the mandated vaccination requirements from the government's order were rolled back. So again, there were sort of two main ways of requiring staff to be vaccinated to carry out their roles. One was the government put legislation in place and said that for particular sectors, education, health, defence, police, border workers, medical and health, for anyone working in those areas, they were required by way of legislation to only carry out those roles if they were fully vaccinated. So that's the main legislative way. And probably for the likes of Albany, there probably wouldn't be many employers in that category. There may be some, but the majority is probably more private businesses for SME levels of business. So the other way is the way that affects the SME businesses which is that you could carry out a health and safety risk assessment for all of the roles in the business to determine whether that assessment said actually, yes, you do need to have only vaccinated workers carrying out the role because of health and safety grounds. So I'm going to focus on that area mostly, but I'll also touch on the legislation order as well. So for the private businesses who had put in place a risk assessment which had determined that only fully vaccinated workers could carry out the duties, then those employers need to really be thinking about, well, what next? If I had that policy in place, if I've only got fully vaccinated workers working, what do I do now? The government has signalled that they think that most of the legislative vaccination orders should be rolled back. So that's one piece of information to consider. And I guess the other big piece is around the changes to the landscape. We are now a highly vaccinated population, and we now have Omicron everywhere. Whereas 6 months ago, we had a much lower vaccination rate across the board, and the virus was not so widespread. And so there was more risk for an employment, from an employment perspective, and more obligation on an employer to consider how are they meeting their health and safety obligations. So with those changes in mind, the signalling from the government that they don't think that most sectors now need to have the mandates, and given the changes to the landscape, employers need to look at their health and safety risk assessments and determine, are they still valid? Are they still a reasonable response to the risk? Is it more risky for a worker to come into the workplace and potentially get COVID and potentially transmit it than it is in their usual everyday life? And for most businesses, the answer is probably going to be no. 6 months ago, the answer probably was going to be yes. For lots of businesses, it might have been more risky for an individual to come to the workplace. They may be interacting with vulnerable people. They may be in a mall having to serve, hundreds of customers. It is more risky, and it was more risky than an individual having their own choices outside of the workplace. But now, arguably, it's not. And so for many businesses, doing that review of the health and safety risk assessment may well show that actually we no longer need that mandate in place. And we no longer need to require new staff to have to be fully vaccinated to carry out their role. So if there are private businesses who have mandates in place, they need to be doing that review of the risk assessment, and they need to communicate with the team. So I remember back in 2020 when the Reserve Bank Governor, it was Adrian Orr then, was doing his first public announcements on the back of the COVID outbreak. And he said that the biggest thing that an employer can do is communicate. And it's a rock steady tenet of employment law, consultation and communication. So if you are needing to do any changes or variations or withdraw the mandate completely, then you need to make sure you're following an employment law consultation process in order to do that. And similarly, but a little bit different, for those businesses who may have been covered by the legislation order, it's a little bit easier because essentially the law is telling you had to have mandates in place. So yes, you needed to consult and communicate with the team, but there was less risk, I guess, for an employer who was covered by the legislation. You still had to determine whether certain roles did fit under the legislative requirements. You still had to consult in accordance with employment law, but you weren't doing your own individual risk assessments, which I guess was more open to interpretation. But still, employers in that category need to now go through a consultation process with the team so that it's clear what direction the business is taking. You're likely to be withdrawing the policy, but you need to then communicate with the staff so that they understand. And I guess overarching all of this is that there is still a massive variety of comfort levels in individuals around how they feel about workplaces reopening to vaccinated and unvaccinated, about how they might feel around having a mandated policy withdrawn. You know, there's a very vocal proportion of society who have been very anti the mandates, but we are a highly vaccinated population, which also shows that the vast majority of people do believe in them and have been willing at least to get them for their own safety and the safety of others. And within that population, there is a segment of society who are worried and who are anxious and who have a high degree of need around safety. And so as an employer, it's really important to consider that not everybody may feel sort of gung-ho about, let's just withdraw the mandates, get everyone back into the office, let's get into it. COVID's, past. That isn't how everybody feels. And so making sure that you have an empathetic response around any withdrawals or amendments to a policy is really important. And I guess that same issue is the issue I wanted to talk about around flexible working and hybrid models in the workplace. So for the last couple of years, many businesses who have been able to have staff continue to be productive at home have had to do that. And again, you've got the front-running employers who are, leading the charge with innovation. They would have already been having some kind of hybrid model, but for the large bulk of SME businesses, that may have been where they were heading, but the pandemic has sped up the process for them getting systems in place and actually trialing it and having to have people at home working. And the research that I've reviewed is that overwhelmingly productivity has been steady. There hasn't been a massive drop in business productivity and revenue for those businesses that could have people in their roles continue to work from home. Obviously, we've got industries like hospitality that have been decimated because of the pandemic, and they are absolutely in a category where this is, no doubt about it, been just destroying the whole livelihood of some industries. Leaving them aside, for the bulk of workplaces that could have people work from home, that has actually been successful. And so that brings to the fore the issue of, well, what now? Auckland has ridden out its peak of the Omicron outbreak. Still, I think there was a bump in numbers from Ashley Bloomfield talked about this morning, but certainly we are over the peak and coming down the other side. So what should workplaces do? Do workplaces respond with a bit of a knee-jerk reaction of requiring everybody back into the office? Is there a kind of ongoing hybrid model that's the best practice to continue going forward? And again, looking overseas, I attended a LinkedIn, it was called Forward 2022 last week, that had the head people and culture and head HR of the likes of LinkedIn, MailChimp, Unilever, and there were a few other very big brands who were attending, and all of them were supporting the proponent of just putting people first, and again, not painting with the same brush everybody in the workplace and not responding from a place of fear. So some employers will rightly want to have everyone in the workplace because they're fearful of a new normal. They want to go back to what it was like before the pandemic. Requiring people to come in to the workplace feels like something that they can control and be in charge of. Research tells us that that's not probably a highly effective way of engaging with the team, and having an engaged, highly performing team without any kind of consultation or communication as to why. Why are you requiring all of your staff to come back in immediately just because the waves passed? What is that based on? Is there a reason for it? Is it because the staff are asking for that? Is it because of the fear and a feeling of a lack of control? Is there a real trust issue with trusting that the team will continue to work from home productively? And I guess those are the things that I would be encouraging employers to really look at, really identify what is it that is driving the desire to have everybody back in. And if it's legitimate and if it's a fundamental part of the business, then let's do it. But let's communicate it really well. Let's make sure there's a lead-in time for staff so that people can get systems set up, perhaps with childcare and things like that they may have had to modify in the last couple of years. And let's communicate the why so that people get on board with what the change is for. Another aspect is also to really think about what is it that we love about being in the same workplace with our colleagues and doing more of that. So rather than a blanket approach of everyone back in, being purposeful again around the why. From a research perspective and a staff survey perspective, it seems to be that if you surveyed 100 people in a workplace, about 67% would be looking for some kind of ongoing hybrid model. And then you've got a proportion who want to be at home all the time, and then another proportion, smaller proportion, who want to be back full time. So the majority of the team are likely to want to continue with a hybrid model. There's a benefit to the employee, mostly around things like travel and having more time in the day, but a benefit also to the business because you do have people wanting to be back in some capacity in the workplace, and a lot of that will hopefully be around connection with colleagues. In terms of that flexibility, hybrid working model, my advice would be to just take stock of what informal or formal policy has been in place for the last couple of years and think about what communication has gone out to the team around that. So that's the starting point. You know, where are we now? What do our team think is the current normal for them with the hybrid working? And then talk to your team, you know, find out what it is that they're wanting, what it is they love about being back in a office or other workplace where everyone's together, and then see if you can accommodate the team's wishes, but also, of course, what is relevant for the business. And if there is a productivity issue, if you have been a business that has dropped in productivity because of a working from home model over the last couple of years, then communicate with that. The team may have some ideas of how to keep the benefit of working from home, but to make sure the business is still being productive. There are some businesses who are taking flexibility to the next level. Most of you, I'm sure, will have heard about Perpetual Guardian Trust and Unilever as well. They've gone to a 4-day week essentially. So their model is, we pay you for 5. We actually think that if you focus 100% on productivity, you can probably get through your work in 4 days, and we'll pay you for that 5th day. So that's another way of some businesses being innovative and supporting their staff to be productive, but also to have a better work-life balance. Obviously, Unilever and Perpetual Guardian Trust are big players in the arena, but in places like Ireland, it's sort of taken off that 4-day week, and lots of smaller businesses have also adopted it. I've been acting for a client who is a small business in the fabrication welding space, and they've gone for a slightly different model where they've just reduced hours on a Friday to give the team essentially kind of like a long lead into the weekend. And that was through consultation with the staff around what would work for them. And that was the feedback. Let's have a half day on Friday. We'll get through more work in the earlier days. And then we're off on a long weekend. Engagement's higher, productivity is the same. And in actual fact, the research from the Perpetual Guardian trial, which they did first, showed that productivity on a 4-day week, but being paid for the 5th day, was exactly the same, but staff engagement had gone through the roof. And so that model was, yes, you're not working 4 10-hour days and getting the 5th day off. You're working 4 days, just being very productive and switched on. And some of the research and the feedback from the staff during the trial on that, staff were saying things like, you know, I used to get emailed from my partner, you know, to my email work address, just, you know, to do various kind of house admin or life admin. And I had to say, you've got to stop. Like when I'm at work, I'm working. That's all I'm doing, because that 5th day, that 5th productivity day that I get off is really important to me. and I have to be 1,000% present to work to ensure that I can get that day off, because the model, the basis of the model was if I don't get through my work in those 4 days, then I do need to work on that 5th day from a productivity perspective. So that's a bit around flexible working and a hybrid model. Again, my communicate is at the essence of how to do that with the team. SurveyMonkey does really easy and quick surveys that you could do if it's not appropriate to be trying to communicate face-to-face if you've got a large business. That would give you some data to then think about, okay, what type of policy do we want going forward around working from home or working from the office, and around productivity when you're in the workplace. And I would always then put a policy in place. Like, it doesn't have to be long, it could just be a one-pager that sets out the expectations and requirements from the business around what that looks like. And you know, you could always do a trial. I'm a big proponent of trialing things, making it clear to the team that it's a trial, and then it's much easier to roll it back or amend it if it's not working for the business. So that would be my advice. Make sure that it's in writing and there's a simple and clear policy in place. It makes the whole operation of a workplace work much better. And to that end, there should be a staff handbook as a very base document. So if people don't have that as a base document, I thoroughly suggest getting one in place. Just to touch on global trends around recruitment and retrenchment of staff, there is a new global trend. Again, these big companies are leading it and feeding back into the rest of us around really making sure you're hiring for skill as well as fit. So I think in the HR space, there has been a bit of a swing towards hiring for fit, and we can train you for skill. And what the new global HR trends are talking about is, yes, fit's important, the culture's absolutely a given, but also be really, really purposeful around what the business needs from a skill perspective. So when you're hiring, make sure you're doing the work up front to see what is it that the business needs, what skills does someone need to bring to the workplace to complement what else we've got, and to make sure the business productivity again jumps up because of those skills. And again, just having a people first culture. So it's no surprise to me that empathetic leadership from a research perspective shows a higher level of staff engagement, a higher level of productivity, lower recruitment costs because there's less churn and less staff turnover. And it's the whole Richard Branson model around you take care of your staff, they'll take care of your clients. And so the roundabout continues. And I'm a big believer in it too. I can see it happen in businesses that do that. And a lot of the work that I do with them is much more front footing. It's much more how can we keep improving policies, improving the workplace environment, improving the experience of the staff, so that they then feed on to the customers and productivity and how they are enjoying and being an advocate of the business. Whereas other businesses can be much more reactive, and it's dealing with disputes and personal grievances and disgruntled staff. And a lot of that is around miscommunication, you know, not having a detailed job description, just a very basic job description, staff handbook, up to date and compliant and robust employment agreements. It does all start there. And that's I guess, the first documentation around communication to your team around what their expectations are, what your expectations are of the role and what they're required to do. In terms of a couple of additional things to note, so we obviously do have the 1 p.m. presser today, as Kevin mentioned, so that is likely to be around the traffic lights. The biggest change if we move to orange will likely be for businesses that host events, indoor events, so lots of the sports, event organisers. Netball is one that comes to mind. You're watching the ANZ Netball Championship across New Zealand, and there's hardly anyone in the stadium. They must be losing money still, hand over fist. But also the likes of Business North Harbour wanting to put on indoor events with a really big capacity, waiting for the government's announcement. So hopefully we do get to move to orange. although, as I mentioned, the case numbers today were a bit of a spike. Matariki, so this is a new public holiday that's been going through Parliament and has now been passed. So the first Matariki public holiday will be this year on the 24th of June, and every year, obviously, thereafter. So that's the newest addition to the public holiday suite. And just acknowledging that for SME businesses, we had the increase to sick leave last year. We've got a new public holiday this year. And for lots of SME businesses, it's tough, particularly in those areas that have been heavily hit by COVID. For some of industries and sectors, actually, the last couple of years have been brilliant financially. But there are also sectors that have been just the absolute opposite. And then some other sectors have been sort of somewhere in the middle, not hit as hard as perhaps they had expected to be, recovered a bit of the bounce back from the 2020 lockdown, and particularly, I guess, for online consumerism, that's also been increasing with people still being in isolation and working from home. I guess just to touch on a reminder around what to do if you do have a staff member who is a household case or a positive case. Just anecdotally from my clients, it is now happening in Auckland less and less, which makes sense given we've passed the peak. But every workplace or business owner I talk to usually has someone affected and someone still self-isolating. So just a reminder, there are the two government payments that are available, the STAP, short-term absence payment, and then the COVID leave support payment, which is probably the one that most businesses will be using at the moment. So if anyone is away because they're getting tested or because they're a household contact or because they're a positive case, just make sure you check whether there are any financial government grants that are available or subsidies. And also make sure with the subsidy, particularly the COVID-19 leave support payment, that you read the declaration. So similarly for the wage subsidy in 2020 and last year, you have to make your application and then declare that you've agreed with all the terms in the declaration, which have similar terms to the wage subsidy. If you remember, there was that whole 80% issue from 2020. So put it briefly, what the government is saying is, yes, if you want to apply for the leave support payment, we'll give you $600 for that first week, but you need to make sure you are still paying entitlements. You need to make sure that you're talking to the staff member around how they want to be paid. Do they want to use sick leave? Are they willing to use annual leave? Or can you not pay 100% of those leave entitlements? If you can't, can you pay 80%? If you can't, you need to at least pay out the $600 from the leave support payment, which is taxed in the hands of the employee. So yes, if you do have someone who tests positive, obviously they're going to be home. The people in their home will become household contacts from that first day of self-isolation of the positive case. And after that 7-day period and the relevant tests, then that household contact who hasn't tested positive can leave self-isolation as well, even if someone else tests positive in the house during that 7-day period. So there are lots of charts that are available that I can also send through that detail out in a bit of a flow diagram how that works. But suffice to say, the number of days has all shortened. We did think several months ago that it could potentially, someone could be in self-isolation for day on day on day, week on week on week, depending on who in the household kept testing positive at different times. But that's not the case, which makes things a little bit easier, but also, I guess, a bit more riskier because people are potentially likely to carry COVID into the community without having symptoms. So, Kevin, those were the issues on my list to talk about. There may well be some questions and very happy to answer, but really wanted to make this a short and sweet update on the global issues that I can see happening and the specific issues that you should be turning your mind to now as SME business owners.
Thanks, Bronwyn. Terrific as ever. There's a couple of questions I've already got that were sent in prior to the webinar starting. But since we've started, just in the Q&A, And for all attendees, if you look in the Q&A, Bronwyn's contact details are there. If you don't want to ask a question now, then feel free to contact her directly. Or if you've got another topic that you'd like to discuss as well, then I'm sure Bronwyn would be delighted to hear from you. But there is a question in the Q&A. If a business decides to retain mandated vaccination across their workers, do they run the risk of workers in the future challenging this on grounds on its validity?
Yeah, it's a great question. So people may have heard through the media that there have been quite a few court cases around vaccination mandates. All of those court cases to date have been around the legislation. So people in the health, disability, education, defence, border worker, in that category of mandates. And so it's been individuals who have been covered by the order, either bringing a judicial review application to the High Court, essentially saying, actually, Minister Hipkins, you have overridden your authority. You haven't taken into account the Bill of Rights in a good enough way. We don't think this order is justified. So there've been about 7 cases that have done that. And there's been other cases where employees who have lost their jobs because of the legislation mandate have taken a claim against the employer and have said, actually, that wasn't fair. You didn't explore other alternatives in a satisfactory manner. I shouldn't have lost my job. My role isn't actually covered by the mandate. This isn't fair. And almost all of those cases, whether they've been judicial review or whether they've been employment jurisdiction cases, have lost. The High Court has repeatedly said, no, the jurisdiction of Minister Hipkins and his ability and right to make the orders that he did were all legitimate, were all lawful, were all reasonable, given the situation. And in the employment jurisdiction, there have been no cases that have been found in favour of the employee. They were all the decisions made by the employers were justified. Apart from one, there's been one case that you may have heard of in relation to police and defence workers. It was called Yardley, and it was a case taken, again, the judicial review case, and the judge said, actually, given the changes around Omicron and given that the justification for those workers getting the vaccine, having the vaccine mandate, was to make sure that the front line of the police in particular was always going to be there, that there weren't going to be huge disruptions to having police out and about and doing their job. Actually, that's not justifiable anymore. You know, we've got I think there was 98% of the police force were vaccinated, and Omicron was through the community everywhere. And so even the individuals who weren't vaccinated probably had some kind of natural immunity because they'd probably got it by now. That's the only case that has, I guess, come down in favour of an individual saying this isn't fair, or this isn't justified. And actually that case has been appealed. So that's going to the Court of Appeal to determine whether the judge got it right, essentially. But what was interesting in that case and in the judgment was that it's very, very clear that you determine reasonableness at the time the policy is in place. So you can't look back to 2021 and say, oh, well, what happened then? Is it reasonable now, given that now we're in Omicron, the vaccination mandates that we put in place then, is it still reasonable now? You can't do that. You have to look back and say, right, well, in December 2021, when the business put in place a vaccination mandate policy, was it reasonable then? And so that answers that question in a way, as in, if a business does do a health and safety risk assessment now, and that shows up actually it is still reasonable to have a vaccination mandate policy in place, then the validity will be looked at now. So you can mitigate risk around that just by making sure the health and safety risk assessment is carried out well. There's lots of health and safety consultants out there, or lawyers like me who do it. So just making sure that you do it appropriately means that you're very unlikely to have that challenged and it being unlawful. Bearing in mind that the government has signalled that they don't think that mandates are required for most sectors, bearing in mind that we're now in an environment with a highly vaccinated population, Omicron everywhere. So you'd have to have a pretty specific business for, I think, for vaccine mandates to still be appropriate. So for example, we have a client who delivers medical equipment into the homes of vulnerable individuals. And so arguably that is still extremely risky. The consequences of transmission to those vulnerable people would be massive. So arguably that would be an industry or a role or a business that could still justify having the mandates.
Thanks, Bronwyn. A couple of the questions that came in earlier. Are you aware of many businesses that are still running shifts or bubbles for their staff? Which again sort of leads into the second question, which is around, are you aware of any other processes in place that businesses are using to avoid staff shortages?
Yes, thanks, Kev. So there are still staff shortages out there. So some businesses, have, I guess, had their big wave of people being away and in self-isolation, and people have come back. But for lots of businesses, there are still issues with not having the whole team back on board. And I was talking to another employment lawyer last night whose usual bus route, into work had been cancelled because there's a massive shortage of bus drivers at the moment. So I guess it depends on which business you're in, which sector you're in, who's being hit at what time. And relating that back to your health and safety risk assessments, that should also look at, so maybe we don't need the vaccination mandate anymore, but what do we need? And every business should have a health and safety policy in place that should relate to the pandemic. So that's another quick and easy go-to make sure you've got your basic documents in place. And that should be relevant for now. There's no reason why that can't be looked at every couple of months and updated, or even every month probably, given the way things are changing. And make sure you're really clear on what health and safety measures do need to be put in place. Do there still need to be shifts and bubbles? And maybe there do. Maybe there does. Making sure you've got key workers in two separate areas of the business who are, never the twain shall meet, to make sure that there isn't a big disruption from a productivity or workflow perspective. I think it's a pretty sensible and reasonable approach. Again, talk to your team. What do they think? Certainly, anecdotally, there are still businesses who are having shifts happen, but equally, there are businesses who are knee-jerk reacting and having everybody back in at once. So I would be recommending, talk to your lawyer, get some real advice about your business and what you need, and what's an appropriate health and safety response for you. And again, communicate with your team. What do they think? What are their levels of comfort around risk? And make sure you're then taking that into consideration. It doesn't mean you do everything that everybody says. Otherwise, you'd never get anything done. You'd be reacting all over the place. But it does mean, as a leader and business owner, that you've heard what the team had to say. You've put that in the mix of your decision making, and then you make a decision and you roll that out in an empathetic, appropriate way.
Terrific, thanks, Bronwyn. There's nothing else come through, so it's probably time now to really thank you sincerely for all that information, those insights. Excellent as ever. As I said a little bit earlier, if anyone wants to contact Bronwyn directly to discuss something else or something from today's webinar, then her contact details are in the Q&A. So just in closing, I really, again, like to thank everyone for attending today. Thanks, Bronwyn, as I say, for your input to today. It's been terrific. And then just looking forward, we've got one more webinar, which will take place early in May, just after the Easter holidays. And that's just about maximising your marketing. So we'll be looking at marketing strategies and the use of social media. In the meantime, just wish you all the very best. Hope everyone has a great Easter holiday, Easter break. And then fingers crossed we get some really positive news at 1 o'clock today. And look forward to seeing you all in person in the not too distant future. Okay, so thanks everyone, thanks Bronwyn, and we'll see you all again soon. Thank you very much indeed.
Everyone, happy Easter.